Good afternoon. May I have your attention, please? My name is George Triandis. I am the Dean of Stanford Law School, and it's a great joy and privilege to welcome you to the Law School for this special Constitution Day event. Welcome all of faculty, students, alumni, staff, and other guests and friends of the Law School to this lecture. I don't need to tell you that Constitution Day commemorates the signing of the U.S. Constitution on September 17th, 1787. And we're here together to celebrate this central legal document that has governed the United States for more than 235 years. It's the world's longest surviving written charter of government, and it allows us to reflect on the countless ways that a nation defined by its a dedication to ideas and to ideals, how it thrives. Federal law designates that there be a Constitution and Citizenship Day and requires educational institutions that receive federal funding to hold an educational program on the U.S. Constitution on that day or on a nearby day like today. And if you have any doubt, you can refer to the law at 36 United States Code Section 106. Do you want me to give you a couple minutes to do that? I will introduce Professor McConnell in a moment, but we are really delighted that Professor Akhil Amar has joined us to deliver this year's Constitution Day lecture that's entitled The Constitution, Originalism, and the Presidency, Questions and Answered. And we are truly honored, Professor Amar, to have such a distinguished speaker. This event is organized and hosted for the university by the Stanford Constitutional Law Center and Stanford Law School. And the Constitutional Law Center was founded in 2006 and focuses particularly on the separation and scope of legislative, executive, and judicial powers, the structure of constitutional democracy, elections and voting, freedom of speech, press, and religion, and the role of history in constitutional interpretation. The center grows out of the long and distinguished tradition of constitutional law scholarship at Stanford Law School, and it seeks to carry on that tradition through a program of conferences, lectures, informal constitutional conversations, and fellowships. And tonight's event is a signal part of this tradition. It's now my great honor and privilege to introduce Professor Michael McConnell, who is the center's faculty director. He is the Richard and Frances Mallory Professor of Law and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. From 2002 to 2009, he served as a circuit judge on the United States Court of Appeal for the 10th Circuit. And upon stepping down from the bench, we are truly fortunate that he joined our faculty at the law school and took on the directorship of the center. Professor McConnell teaches courses on constitutional law, constitutional history, the First Amendment, and interpretive theory. He has published widely in the fields of constitutional law and theory, especially on church and state, equal protection, and separation of powers. In his book, The President Who Would Not Be King, Executive Power Under the Constitution, was published by Princeton University Press in 2020. In addition to his scholarship, Professor McConnell is widely and frequently quoted as a constitutional law expert in top-tier media, and we are really fortunate to have such a distinguished scholar in our faculty. As I recite this, I'm thinking, I'm not telling you anything most of you don't already know about Professor McConnell, so I'm simply being a little bit repetitive here. But Michael, I will now turn things over to you so that Professor McConnell can introduce the speaker, Akhil Amar, and today's topic. Thank you.
Thank you, George. wanted to add my special welcome, especially to the first-year students who are here, whom I have yet to get to know, but there's always a healthy contingent of them at the Constitution Day lecture, and you were especially warmly welcomed. I'd also like to welcome and recognize an old friend of the Stanford Law School and an alum, Judge Carlos Bea from the Ninth Circuit, who is with us this evening. So as Dean Triantis just recited, the United States Constitution was drafted, completed in September of 1787, some 237 years ago, and we are still engaged in pondering it, studying it, learning from it. The first-year students will have their first constitutional law class in the winter, but following that, we have any number of other courses on First Amendment and 14th Amendment and executive power and constitutional history and so forth. So you have a rich series of studies of this subject ahead of you. Tonight we have one of the nation's foremost expositors of the Constitution. Just to give you an account of some of his prominent books alone tells you the story. His most recent, The Words We Live By, he's been autographing and giving copies out in the foyer. The Constitution, a Biography, the Bill of Rights. He covers the waterfront. He's the Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale, where he has taught since 1985. But rather than giving a whole bunch of biographical details, including, by the way, the fact that we've been friends for just about 40 years, I want to tell you just a little something substantive about the place, the unusual, maybe even the unique place that Akhil Amar plays in American constitutional scholarship. He is unusual, not just for the quality of his work, but for the fact that he is a self-styled originalist. This is the point of view that the Constitution needs to be understood and interpreted in light of its original history and understanding at the time. He is also a self-styled liberal progressive politically. And this is interesting because in these days of ours, with increasing polarization on so many dimensions, it is often thought that to be an originalist means you have to be a right-winger, and that to be a progressive liberal, you have to reject a historical approach to interpretation of the Constitution. So Akhil is living, breathing proof that those things are not true, and thus I think will be one of the things that results in, by the way, is almost everybody's been mad at him at one time or another. So we'll see whether his talk tonight makes any of us mad, but I guarantee that it's going to make us interested. So welcome Akhil to the platform.
Oh, thank you so very much. It's good to be home. I grew up here in the Bay Area. We're going to be talking about originalism, and from a certain point of view, this is the place that I originate. I was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I was there a week ago, but we moved to the Bay Area when I was 2 years old, and so this is home for me, my point of origin, so to speak. My wife and I, who just celebrated our 35th anniversary earlier this month, we had two of our three kids, our two most recent kids, originated here. They were born when I was visiting at the Stanford Law School in 2001. Thank you, Judge Bea. And I was thinking about them this morning as I came back to the campus, because we came out here so that they could be born near their grandparents. You just heard a little bit about how the Constitution originated. I'm going to say a little bit about that. Then we're going to move to the presidency. I'm going to try to connect them because in case you missed it, your fellow citizens are thinking about the presidency right now. Okay, so here's what you already have been told. That in mid-September 1787, the Federal Convention that met behind closed doors at Philadelphia over the summer of that year unveiled, made public, published a plan, a proposed constitution in mid-September 1787. Thus originated what would become the Constitution of the United States. And this proposed Constitution was put to a series of votes up and down the continent. We, the people, did in actual fact ordain and establish a Constitution. That's what the preamble says. We, the people, do ordain and establish. In that process, more people were allowed to vote on how they and their posterity would be governed than had ever been allowed to vote on anything before in the history of planet Earth, and by a very wide margin. I call it the hinge of human history, the year that changed everything, this year of origin. There had been democracies on planet Earth, or self-governing societies, from time to time. They were not the norm at all. But you had ancient Athens, just for a bit, self-government under the Periclean Constitution, the Cleisthenic Constitution in the age of Socrates. There was pre-imperial Rome, there was Venice, there was Florence, and these self-governing republics did flourish for a while, but in most places, in most times, in the history of planet Earth, there are not self-governing societies. The history of the world is the history of kings, emperors, czars, sultans, Mughal lords, tribal chieftains, thugs all. And even the places that had self-government, even if they had some sort of organization or schema that might be called the Constitution, even if they had a written Constitution, never had democratic constitution-making processes. These constitutions had never been voted on by the people they purported to govern. You had lawgivers handing down the law from on high. Declaration of Independence, not put to a vote. Articles of Confederation, not put to a vote. None of the constitutions in 1776, the state constitutions, were put to a vote. There were constitutions in Massachusetts and New Hampshire put to votes in the early 1780s, but not on a continental scale. Britain has self-government to some extent at the time, but it has a king no one voted for, House of Lords no one voted for. There's some self-government in Switzerland, but truthfully there are more sheep than humans in Switzerland at the time. And the Dutch are in the process of losing their self-government, and so are the Florentines. And so there's very little self-government across the planet, but nowhere really have the people prior to the 1780s ever democratically enacted their supreme law. That's the year that we mark today, this year of origins, the hinge of human history, where in 8 of the 13 states, property qualifications were actually lowered or eliminated for this special election on rules for themselves and their posterity. In New York, for example, all adult free male citizens could vote on the plan. No race tests, no religious tests, no property qualifications. Those aren't the ordinary rules in New York. They're the rules for this special we do year. And the world, and you could oppose the thing, since they mentioned freedom of speech as a very important part of the center here. You could oppose the thing and you wouldn't be voted off the island. That's a Survivor reference, but it comes from the Greek ostracism. People were voted off the Peloponnesus, basically, for being controversial or ornery. You could oppose the Constitution and later become President of the United States. James Monroe, Vice President, Elbridge Gerry, George Clinton, Justice on the Supreme Court, Samuel Chase. This is astonishing. The people who opposed the Constitution said, yes, but where are the rights? Dudes, you forgot the rights. And they were correct about that. And even though they lost, here's what's amazing. They lost by this much, but they actually acquiesced They didn't stage an insurrection. The votes were counted fairly, and they said, okay, we lost fair and square, but we had a point. And the winners who won by this much listened to them. And what emerged is what we call the Bill of Rights. Wow, it would be as if today, the two parties could get together and come up with a sensible plan for border security. Like, what a concept. The two parties actually listening to each other. This actually did happen once. And the Americans who saw it were preposterously proud of this. Nothing like this, nothing close to this had ever happened in world history. And today, the planet by population and landmass is largely democratic, not perfectly so, but I think about my parents today, especially my mom would have been 92 tomorrow. And when she's born, my dad's still around. He's in California, 95. But when they're born, 1 billion people, India didn't have 1 billion then, but a subcontinent was governed by a king halfway across the world that no one voted for, a House of Lords, a parliament that no one voted for, you see. That was in their lived lifetime. And now it's 1 billion people with a B. It's imperfect, but they got a constitution and elections and a court and rights and some religious liberty and parties that alternate power. It's not perfect, but actually neither is our system even today. And we could talk about Japan, and we could talk about Central Europe. We could talk about Western Europe. At the time the Constitution is adopted, France is an absolutist tyranny. And today it's a not bad republic. I think California is better. Truthfully, I do. I think California treats its racial and religious minorities better than does France. But this was the hinge of human history. This was the Big Bang. Almost no democracies before this year that we commemorate, and now lots of democracies, imperfect, but that's what we are commemorating today, this point of origin, not just of the American project, but really of the modern world, of a democratic world. I'm going to connect that to the presidency by telling you about the early presidents. And you're going to hear in this talk how the early generations thought about America's founding, about America's origins, especially when thinking about America's early presidents. This is from volume 2. What I'm reading of a trilogy that's unfolding. You have the Fellowship of the Ring. That's the words that made us. And it's a pun, us, the U.S., we the people. And we talked ourselves into a we-ness, into a unity, into a union by conversing with each other. The subtitle is America's Constitutional Conversation, 1760 to 1840. In 1760, there is no America. There's Massachusetts, there's New York, there's Connecticut, there's South Carolina, Pennsylvania. They don't talk to each other. That's 1760. That's chapter 1. But by the end of chapter 2, they're talking to each other. And by the end of chapter 3, they're actually uniting to declare their independence from this regime and giving facts to a candid world. So that's the Fellowship of the Ring, the first volume of this trilogy, this saga of the history of America. What I'm now going to be reading from you is volume 2, the conversation from 1840 to 1920. This one basically ends when all the framers die out. The framers' generation dies, 1840. Next one picks up then, 1840 to 1920. It's called Born Equal. America's Constitutional Conversation, 1840-1920. It's about black equality and liberty. It's about women's equality. It's going to end with women getting the vote everywhere in America, leading the way one day for a woman to be, vice president of the United States, maybe president. So that's the story of volume 2. And there's going to be a lot of time for questions and answers, and you can ask me today why we should be originalist, and I'll give you my candid answer to that. But first, I want to tell you how the early generations thought about originalism, especially in the context of the presidential elections that they confronted. I'll say it one other way. If you don't know your history, If you don't know your Constitution, how are you going to do your job in November? Okay? We're picking the leader whose first responsibility is to take an oath to the Constitution. But if you don't know what the Constitution actually says, how are you going to pick that person? If you don't know who the early presidents are and who was good and who was bad, how are you going to actually discharge your responsibilities? And the only thing, my friends, that we Americans have in common, truthfully, is our Constitution and the story behind it, because we don't have race or religion or ethnicity or politics or even geography. I'll say more about that in just a bit. But I think all Americans, what we have in common is this Constitution and the story behind it. And so I'm going to tell you how that story starts to unfold at the beginning, especially in the context of picking the early presidents. So this is a section called The First 14. When we consider the first 14 presidential elections, an astonishing pattern snaps into focus. In almost every one of these elections, the new nation chose a man who, in one way or another, powerfully and accurately, not merely vacuously or implausibly, reminded his fellow Americans of their origins as a people, as embodied in the 1776 Declaration and the 1787 Constitution. Via these quadrennial contests of national identity formation and reformation, antebellum America revealed itself as an unabashedly originalist land, a fledgling country fiercely proud of its origins, its founding documents and founding fathers, and deeply suspicious of foreign threats to the new nation's hard-won independence. Antebellum America was also a land awash in words and images, especially words and images brought home by the new nation's countless newspapers. Yes, there was a thing back then called newspapers, and print shops, reinforced by iconic art and by the fledgling technologies of photography and telegraphy. Originalism of a powerful sort and a complementary media strategy of a potent kind. This was the winning formula for most of America's early presidential elections. In the first two presidential elections, all participating electors voted for George Washington, and did so precisely because he preeminently embodied the 1776 Declaration and the 1787-88 Constitution. True, Washington neither drafted nor signed the Declaration. In the summer of 1776, he was already in the field in obedience to his high commission from the Continental Congress itself. In other words, he was already and dramatically risking his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor. And after Congress acted in early July, Washington was risking his all precisely to secure the Declaration's objective, independence from Britain. As America's supreme military commander throughout the Revolutionary War, Washington received by proxy the British sword of surrender at Yorktown, and later laid down his own sword before his civilian superiors, the Confederation Congress, in Annapolis. This dazzling combination of military might and Republican restraint made him at war's end the most celebrated man in the world, unique in the annals of modern history. America's Cincinnatus, the general who would not be king, the virtuous defender of his country who spurned a throne that was his for the taking. And of course, you should read Michael's book about the president who would not be king. These epic Revolutionary War moments continued to loom large in American memory and iconography long after every participant and eyewitness was in the grave. Alongside John Trumbull's monumental Declaration tableau, celebrating America's greatest revolutionary congressmen, Adams, Jefferson, and Franklin, 3 other massive Trumbull oils came to the Capitol Rotunda in the mid-1820s. One of these depicted America's 1777 victory at Saratoga, a pivotal moment and portent of America's ultimate triumph. The other 2 gargantuan paintings, so there are 4. There's the Declaration of Independence, there's Saratoga, and then these 2 more. I think I'm going to try to show them. Let's see if this works. These other 2 monumentalized Washington above all others. Oh, it did work. How cool. In the first painting, and there are versions of this, I have to just tell you. Smaller versions in the Yale University Art Gallery if you ever come to visit Yale. In the first painting, America's military commander, that would be George Washington, sits astride his steed near his flag alongside his troops in Yorktown in 1781, see in the background, modestly allowing his mounted next in command, Benjamin Lincoln, to accept the British surrender center stage. And that's because Cornwallis feigned or asserted his, that he was indisposed, and so he wasn't going to be able to present the sort of surrender personally. And so Washington says, well, if you're going to send your second in command, I'm going to actually have it accepted by my second in command. Washington's very exquisitely attentive to etiquette, okay? But there's a modesty here. He's willing to stay in the background and allow Benjamin Lincoln to accept the British surrender center stage. The short colonel, Alexander Hamilton, also features notably in this depiction, standing directly in front of the gray American horse in our right foreground. I'll come back to Hamilton in just a bit. The horse is bowing, you see, to Hamilton. Very, very, very polite horse. In the second painting, and you need to see these as together as they would be in Capitol Rotunda, the modest Washington keeps his own sword sheathed on his left side as he turns his back on the metaphoric chair/throne and the cloak/robe behind him at Annapolis in 1783, while using his right hand, the hand of power, to return the wartime commission that had vested him with dictatorial authority while the war had lasted. He has power of life or death over all Americans, and he's giving Rome style, and he's giving it back. He's surrendering his power, you see. He's, and this is astonishing in the history of the world. The metaphoric world and the metaphoric future, male and female, young and old, us, you see, look on from behind and above, amazed and awestruck. So we are like those two angelic little girls in their dresses here who just are looking at this and they're amazed. Martha, she's actually not there. In fact, that's allegorical, up above everything looking down. She's actually waiting at home in Mount Vernon for George to return home, and he'll make it Christmas Day. George Washington was not the only man, George Washington was not only the man who more than any other made the 1776 words declaring American independence actual facts in the ensuing years, but also the man who more than any other made the Constitution itself in 1787-88. Indeed, he was the man for whom the Constitution was made. So in that book there, I'm going to make the case it's not Madison's Constitution at all. He's not the father of the Constitution. That's preposterous. It's Washington's Constitution in every way. And I'm building on that thought. Summoned from his initial retirement to ride again to America's rescue, you see, because this Yorktown one is 1781. And then 1783, we finally have the peace treaty, and he goes back home. 1787, he's coming back from retirement to Philadelphia because his country needs him again after he basically faded away. Summoned from his initial retirement to ride again, once again to America's rescue, Washington presided by acclamation at the Philadelphia conclave. Everyone picks him as the presiding officer. We call it the president because he's the presider, the presiding officer at Philadelphia itself. He was Mr. President at Philadelphia. The proposed Constitution that emerged from the conclave, while generally resembling America's best state constitutions, deviated from these cherished texts and from the extant Articles of Confederation in two key respects. If you're an originalist, you know history. You don't know dictionaries. That's Scalia. That's not true originalism. True originalists know history. Okay? And so you have to compare the Constitution to the Articles of Confederation and to the state constitutions. That's what you have to do. And there are two big differences. First, the federal Constitution created a powerful and indivisible continental regime for reasons of national security. Second, the document vested vast power in the chief executive of that regime, conjuring up a new president immensely more powerful than any state governor. They didn't have typically veto pens and pardon pens, and they didn't have 4-year terms, perpetual re-eligibility, independent election, okay? These were Washington's 2 must-haves. In the ratification process, Washington's supporting letter accompanying the Philadelphia Plan carried more weight than any other piece of advocacy, and indeed carried the day. Countless thousands of wavering Americans ultimately backed the document simply because Washington backed it, and because everyone hoped that when yet again summoned from Mount Vernon, he would helm the new ship of state, which he did. So no Washington, maybe no America, maybe no Constitution. He's the indispensable man. James Madison gets hit by lightning on the road to Philadelphia, no difference. The 5 presidential elections that followed Washington's final resignation after he completed his second term, in the 5 presidential elections that followed Washington's final resignation after he completed his second term, Americans each time tapped not just a founding father, but arguably the remaining founding father most closely linked to the founding and to its 2 epic texts, the Declaration of 1776 and the Constitution of 1787. Washington chose to announce his resignation in an open letter to his countrymen in late September 1796, on precisely the 9th anniversary of his 1787 open letter to America urging adoption of the proposed Constitution. As his fellow citizens began to ponder life without him, they quickly came to see that only 5 men, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, could with any plausibility claim to be America's top remaining and realistically eligible founding father. Benjamin Franklin was long in the grave. So too were John Hancock, Richard Henry Lee, and many other signers of the Declaration and/or the Constitution. Nearing his 75th birthday, Samuel Adams was almost a decade older than the retiring president. Many other great men of the founding were likewise well past their prime. Among the 5 potential contenders, John Jay might have made a fine president, but neither the Declaration nor the Constitution bore his signature, nor had he personally helped draft either document. Still, he had served as the president of the Continental Congress early in the war for American independence, had helped Franklin negotiate the war-ending Treaty of Paris, and had later played a leading role securing the Constitution's ratification, especially in his pivotal home state of New York. Back in 1789, he had received more presidential electoral votes in the double ballot process than anyone save Washington and Adams. Jefferson received none that year. Alas, Jay's diplomatic willingness in the mid-1790 negotiations with the British to insist on reparations, his unwillingness in the mid-1790s negotiations with the British to insist on reparations for American slaves that Britain had freed in the Revolutionary War, destroyed his political viability in the South, especially Virginia, and doomed any chances he might otherwise have had. He was supposed to insist that they have to reimburse Americans for freeing slaves in the war, and he didn't want to do that, and that doomed him. Although Alexander Hamilton had played no part in drafting or signing the Declaration, in 1776 he was barely in his 20s, if that. He had yoked himself early, endearingly, and enduringly to Washington. He had also been indispensable, even more important than Jay, in securing the Constitution's ratification. But in 1796, Hamilton was at most 41 years old, too young, even though technically eligible. Over the course of nearly 2.5 centuries, Americans have never chosen anyone this green. Like Jay and Hamilton, James Madison could claim considerable credit for the Constitution itself. The diligent Virginian had worked heroically alongside these 2 New Yorkers as part of Publius, the pseudonym that the 3 men had used to compose a brilliant and detailed set of newspaper essays urging ratification of the Philadelphia Plan. More important, since Publius's identity was not known to everyone in 1796, Madison had also openly orchestrated the case for the Constitution in the Richmond Ratifying Convention in Virginia. Earlier, Madison had featured prominently in the drafting decisions made at Philadelphia, although not so prominently as would later be claimed by his enthusiasts over the ensuing centuries. In any event, Americans in 1796 could not easily assess Madison's role behind closed doors at Philadelphia. The most comprehensive account of these deliberations, Madison's own notes, would not come before the public until after his death. Most important of all, Madison in 1796 deferentially positioned himself behind his mentor, Thomas Jefferson, Madison's Virginia elder who had shone on a continental stage in 1776 far beyond anything that the stripling Madison had himself done that year back in Virginia. That's the Declaration of Independence with Jefferson, of course, center stage. That left, if you're doing the math, okay, not Jay, not Hamilton, not Madison, that left John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Adams, Jefferson Sr., won the top prize in 1796. But once in power, Adams suppressed newspaper critics. Americans in 1800 thus named Jefferson and renewed this Virginia Declarationist's tenure in office in 1804. Ironically, Adams failed to learn the lesson of his own youth as a newspaper critic. Americans despised the 1765 Stamp Act, not just because it imposed taxation without representation, but also because it taxed newspapers, an indispensable instrument of Republican self-government. Unsurprisingly, newspapers in the 1760s used their printing presses to rally Americans against this imposition on newspapers. Likewise, the Virginia and Kentucky resolves of the 1790s enabled newspapers once again to rally Americans in support of newspapers. Do not pick a fight with the press. Okay. In 1808, 1809, Jefferson emulated Washington by resigning after a second term. So now we've got the first five. 2 of Washington, 1 of Adams, 2 of Jefferson. Given that Jay had retired from politics in 1801 and Hamilton had died in a duel in 1804, only Madison remained. Undeniably the most distinguished available founder, the man most closely linked to the great deeds and the great documents that have made America. America's proud of its founding, ridiculously proud of it. No one in the world has ever done anything like this. And they're again and again and again re-ratifying and re-ratifying the founding by picking the great founders as their leaders, you see. Trumbull's 1820s resignation masterpiece, that's this one, cleverly hinted at Jefferson's eventual emulation of Washington by positioning the red-headed Confederation congressman directly opposite the general's outstretched resignation instrument. So he's got his hand stretched out, and right opposite him is the red-headed Jefferson. And the resignation instrument is this military commission that's being returned in 1783. Trumbull also used poetic license to paint a standing Madison into the resignation scene halfway between and notably above Washington's outstretched hand and Jefferson's observant head. Madison actually wasn't there in the room when it happened. Although Madison was not actually present to witness the 1783 resignation, Trumbull slyly tells us that this short and slight balding figure depicted on the far wall is the man who will rise when Jefferson emulates Washington. There's sort of a triangle there. The hand is outstretched, Jefferson's there to see it, and Madison's the person who will rise. Madison's intimate familiarity with the Constitution's text and its ratifying history arguably rendered him even more fit for the presidency than were his 2 immediate predecessors. A president's first obligation was to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. A president's first duty in office was to take a solemn oath to do just that. Oh, and if you want to ask me about presidential oaths in the Q&A, happy to talk about that. For all their virtue and past service to the new nation, Adams and Jefferson were, by dint of their biographies and lived experiences, more declarationists than constitutionalists. As American, they're connected to 1776. As American diplomats in Europe in 1787-88, neither man had even witnessed, much less participated in, the actual, small c, Constitution itself, the epic deliberations and votes by which Americans did in fact ordain and establish, constitute a new, profoundly democratic and emphatically indivisible American order. Rip Van Adams never fully understood the democratic part, and Rip Van Jefferson never fully understood the indivisible part. Madison understood both. Okay, so now 2 of Washington, Adams, 2 of Jefferson, 2 of Madison. We're up to 7 of the first 14. The 5 presidential elections that followed Madison's resignation after 2 terms, a la Washington and Jefferson, presented an obvious challenge to the new nation. America was running out of top founders. But the new nation was still proud of, nay, obsessed by, its founding. Americans did not generally choose leaders who mocked America's original deeds and documents, or who called for a sharp break with America's national and natal, that is birth-related, narratives. Nor did Americans generally choose leaders who simply made things up in the name of the Constitution, or merely paid lip service to the nation's origins. Rather, this is my thesis, Americans repeatedly chose presidents who in one way or another, often in multiple ways, both consciously and subliminally, powerfully reminded their countrymen of propositions and personalities that were, in fact, at the heart of the 1776 Declaration and the 1787-88 Constitution. Madison's successor, James Monroe, had neither signed nor helped draft the Declaration. But he had risked his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor fighting under and alongside Washington in 1776 to secure America's independence. Though he had voted against ratifying the Constitution in the Richmond Convention of 1788, he had nonetheless played a notable and constructive role in the nation's constitutional conversation that year. Thanks to thoughtful and moderate anti-federalists such as Monroe, the new nation added a needed set of amendments, what we today call the Bill of Rights, shortly after ratification. Even people who vote against the thing are part of the founding project. You see, they're not revolting against it, they're working to make amends, to improve it. And Monroe, you see, is part of that. They're not voted off the island. In a tense international crisis in the mid-1790s, Washington himself handpicked Monroe to ease relations with America's most powerful ally, France. Yeah, back then, actually, they were significant. Over the ensuing decade, Monroe apprenticed himself. Don't tell this to anyone from France, but, you know. Over the ensuing decade, Monroe apprenticed himself to Madison, who ultimately positioned him as heir apparent. In the Second War of American Independence, what we call the War of 1812, Madison eventually tapped Monroe to spearhead the war effort. American independence was the essence of both the Declaration and the Constitution, the 2 documents' common denominator. In electing and later re-electing Monroe, Americans were thus re-ratifying their founding instruments and ideas. Then came JQA, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson, both of whom also embodied fierce American independence from Britain. JQA recapitulated his Declarationist sire in obvious ways. Jackson's triumph at New Orleans in America's Second War of Independence recalled and surpassed Washington's victory at Yorktown in America's First War of Independence. One humorous cartoonist depicted the 1824 contest as Our Jackson versus John Adams's Our Son Jack. In 1824, John Quincy Adams chose as his running mate another son of a Declaration signer, Richard Rush. Though this generational reincarnation of the legendary John Adams-Benjamin Rush team of 1776 failed to prevail at the polls, the salience of 1776 was hard to miss fully a half-century after the first Independence Day. In 1828, Americans, in effect, opted for a second Washington, Andrew Jackson, over a second Adams, partnering with a second Rush. When Jackson won re-election and then resigned after his second term, a la Washington, Americans put his vice president in power just as they had done for Washington. So, okay, 2 Washingtons, Adams, 2 Jeffersons, 2 Madisons, 2 Monroes, another Adams, 2 Jacksons. We're getting close here. up to 13. Okay, how many of you know who's after Jackson? Do you know? Well done. And you are going to take your citizenship. Yes. Okay. How many of you can, this is how we die as a people, because truthfully, how many of you can stand up and name your presidents? And if you can't, this is a problem, you see. And I'm being straight with you. I could do this in Walnut Creek, California at age 8, and I still can, and I'm still obsessed by them. So it is Martin Van Buren. And damn it, if you are the hiring committee for the next president, you need to know this stuff. You know, you all know like how John Elway compares to other great quarterbacks or something, you know, whether you're talking about Tom Brady or Peyton Manning or something like that. But if you don't know your Martin Van Buren, but this time, in 1836-37, the ex-Veep new president broke with the general originalist pattern. Martin Van Buren did not truly conjure up strong memories of 1776 or 1787-88, as had John Adams back in 1796-97. MVB, Martin Van Buren, was neither a military hero in the Washington mold, nor a constitutional thinker in the tradition of Adams, Jefferson, and Madison. He was a gifted politico, but not much more. He had not thought deeply about the Declaration of the Constitution. He could not sing the song of these texts. He called to mind most of all the 1790s electioneering wizard Aaron Burr, who was himself highly unusual among America's early presidential contenders in not having been at center stage in either 1776 or 1787-88. For decades, rumors circulated without evidence that Van Buren was Burr's illegitimate son. Though factually wrong, the rumor felt politically right because of structural similarities between the two men. Each was a political contortionist, a twisty trimmer. Each knew how to creatively collect and closely count votes. At his best, Burr supported, albeit unsuccessfully back in 1785, the immediate abolition of slavery in New York, and had also embraced enlightened ideas about women's rights and capacities. But he had never authored any elaborate defense of his ideas on these topics or any other topic of constitutional significance. In this respect, Van Buren was indeed Burr's true heir, a clever doer, but not a deep thinker, at least not a powerful expositor. Neither Burr nor Van Buren was, nor even tried to be, a deep and dedicated student of the Declaration or Constitution. Abraham Lincoln's they were not. Lincoln himself was both a serious student of the founding, better than any of his contemporaries, and a gifted politico, every bit as canny as Burr and Van Buren. And I'm going to end by telling you a little bit about Abe. Once in office, Van Buren failed. The Panic of 1837 occurred on his watch, and voters plausibly attributed the ensuing economic convulsion to the incumbent's feeble bank policies. Oh, and there was high inflation then, too. No. I'm getting confused. The man who bested Van Buren in 1840, William Henry Harrison, I should have asked you who it was, but anyway, today receives almost no attention in popular or scholarly circles. Had Harrison lived longer than his mere month in the White House, Americans today would pay him more heed, and see more clearly the early originalist pattern he epitomized. Like Jackson, Harrison was a national military hero in the tradition of Washington. William Henry Harrison, too, had beaten the British in an American War of Independence. Like Jackson's victory at New Orleans in 1815, Harrison's military triumph in the 1813 Battle of the Thames on America's northwest border cast a long political shadow. Both Lewis Cass, the Democrats' eventual nominee in 1848, and Cass's running mate, William Orlando Butler, had fought under William Henry Harrison at the Thames, as had Richard Mentor Johnson, Van Buren's running mate in both 1836 and 1840, and America's vice president from early 1837 to early 1841. Like Jackson, in 1828, Harrison in 1840 used clever campaign slogans and symbols aimed especially at frontier America. Most high school history students today learn about hard cider, log cabins, and the alliterative jingle. What's the jingle for William Henry Harrison? Tippecanoe and Tyler too, yes. Also alliterative, but this is actually more significant, more openly regional, More proudly jingoistic and fiercely pro-independence was an 1840 poster presenting General Harrison as the Washington of the West. That's what it says on the bottom there. The crossing cannons in the bottom of the poster depicted field pieces that were captured from the British in 1813. Coming close to the end here. Pictures and posters, however, capture only part of Harrison's story and his appeal. Virtually every newspaper biography in 1840 began by informing readers that the general's father, Benjamin, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Thus, 2 of America's first 4 presidents, after the last of the true 76ers, Monroe, left the scene, were sons of America's truest 76ers. Also, a third son, Richard Rush, was runner-up for the vice presidency in this era. To put these remarkable facts in context, let's recall that the three large colonies took the lead in championing independence in 1776. Massachusetts up north, Pennsylvania, more cautiously in the middle, and Virginia further south. Those are your big 3 states. These 3 proud and powerful colonies generated 21 men who signed the Declaration of Independence. Roughly half of these men sired sons who were still living and were the right presidential age at any time between 1825, when Monroe leaves, and 1841, when William Henry Harrison is inaugurated. What are the odds that out of nearly 1 million white American men of their generation, this tiny cluster of 10 or so fathers would beget 2 presidents and a vice presidential runner-up? Astronomically low, unless Americans were in fact intensely proud of their founding and their founders. Indeed, the very fact that William Henry Harrison was in his late 60s and thus plainly too old, Joe Biden, in 1840 to 41, was nonetheless nominated and elected. The fact that this guy's too old and they still pick him, adds still more support to the originalist pattern that now hides in plain sight, all but unnoticed. So this is, I wrote this a while ago, but this is, one refutation of Jonathan Knapp's thought that these guys are anti-originalist or something like that. They're ridiculously originalist in every way. There's lots more evidence, and if you ask me, I'll give you, more. But those are the first 14. Now I'm going to just tell you just a little bit about the one that you really care most about. His name is Abe. From his earliest years in public life, Abraham Lincoln was a priest of the dominant cult of founder worship. By the end of his career, he was America's high priest, a man who had first come to statewide and national attention via sophisticated, we used to have sophisticated constitutional debates. You remember the debate we just saw? Okay, I'm going to say we used to have sophisticated constitutional debates in 1854 and 1858 with the far more famous Stephen A. Douglas. Though Douglas won the 1858 Senate election that followed the second round of debates, Lincoln won the debates themselves. He trounced he trounced Douglas on the merits of the Constitution and did so with originalist arguments about that document and its predecessor declaration. He became America's president and later became one of America's 2 greatest presidents precisely because he was truly the founder's son. This guy is a nobody from nowhere, and he becomes president because he's an astonishing originalist. Okay? And it's right there for all of us to see. 77 years ago, do the math. It's in every speech the guy ever gives. Read Cooper Union, read the first inaugural, read the second inaugural. Gettysburg Address, Peoria. Okay. To recast this last point with a touch of whimsy and poetic license, let us imagine, in the spirit of Mary Shelley's 1818 Frankenstein novel, that a brilliant and benign early 19th century American scientist named Dr. Founderson dreamed of extracting the best qualities of each of America's top founders so that he might then splice these qualities together into one person, a perfect founding son. Because that's the kind of amazing stuff that you guys think about here in the Silicon Valley, just like, imagining stuff that no one ever thought, could be. Our fantastical Dr. Founderson hoped to create someone with, and these are the big six of the American founding. They're the six preeminent heroes of that book, and you know them all by acclamation. They're your first four presidents: Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, plus, of course, Dr. Franklin and Alexander Hamilton. Those are, and then there are other, great people, but they're second tier, the John Hancocks and the Patrick Henrys and the Gouverneur Morrises and John Jays and John Marshalls, but those are your big six. Our fantastical Dr. Founderson hoped to create someone with Benjamin Franklin's humble origins, homespun self-deprecating wit, newspaper savvy, and gentle genius. Alexander Hamilton's continental vision, constitutional acumen, oratorical prowess, and steel trap mind. James Madison's political shrewdness, organizational talent, and analytic rigor. John Adams's reverence for law, personal rectitude, legendary honesty, and willingness to listen to smart women. Thomas Jefferson's poetic gifts, utopian vision, and personal charm. And George Washington's muscular resolve, unremitting unionism, stoic perseverance, and geostrategic judgment. Geographically, Founderson dreamed of a man who incarnated America, a man like Hamilton who would be the son of the nation more than of any single state, and a man like Washington who could blend Southern birth with Western vision and Northern values. In short, Founderson would have tried to create Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so that's what I've got so far. That's volume 2. It's going to be out in a year from now, so thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I hope we have time for your questions and comments.
Briefly, we're running a little late.
Sorry about that.
So please come with your questions up to the microphones in the aisle. No questions about, say, why Washington fired Monroe?
Or why we have the Electoral College, or what is this, or anything.
No, after you, sir. After you.
You seem to use the term originalist, originalism, to mean a certain nostalgia or fondness for the founding rather than the current term, which is an attempt to understand and recreate the thinking of the founders in order to make judicial decisions. Is that correct? Am I missing something?
I'm basically saying you have to pay attention to what the Constitution says, and you can't understand what the Constitution says unless you understand the historical background beneath it. As distinct from, and here's the question, Jonathan, you're against originalism, but what are you for? What's the alternative? And it seems to me the alternatives are just making stuff up, or just following precedent, which is principled. Oh, but the precedents are Dred Scott. And the precedents are Plessy versus Ferguson. And in the 1930s, the precedents are, no protection of political expression, and the Bill of Rights doesn't apply against the states. So originalists believe we're constitutional fundamentalists of a certain sort. We're a little bit like Martin Luther, and we say, basically, it's the text, here we stand, and it's the history underlying the text, because the text actually has meaning in light of what generated it. I think the best of us originalists pay attention not just to the text of the founding, but the text of the later constitutional amendments, the text of the Reconstruction generation, the text of the progressive era that, for example, gave women the vote and provided for direct election of senators, the text of the 1960s led by people like MLK who rallied Americans, this is in our lifetime, some of us, for voting rights for young adults or getting rid of poll tax disfranchisement. Originalists basically privilege the Constitution's text, history, and structure over other considerations like precedent or policy.
Hey there, and thank you for the talk. So I would love if you could speak a little bit about, especially how we're talking about how, most of us, like probably well-educated in the audience here, one could assume, but, probably could not name that Martin Van Buren, was coming next in that list, right?
Right.
So I'm wondering, if you have thoughts on when, even closer to the founding, when voting American citizens started to maybe get a hazier view of the founding, and maybe they had that same sort of reverence for the founding, but didn't recall the details.
Let's take Abe Lincoln. He's got less than a year's formal education in his entire life. Not advanced education, I'm talking about kindergarten through everything. Less than a year of classroom in his whole life, but he reads and reads and reads, and oh my God, he actually knows the history of America, and he celebrates it, and there's a culture. And 50,000 farmers show up to hear a constitutional debate in the Midwest, okay? I understand there's not Netflix and other things going on, but, and when did we start to lose that? I'm not a big fan, truthfully, of Woodrow Wilson and some of the folks who, they're so smart, these Princeton boys, okay? They're smarter than the Constitution. They're not. They just think they are, okay? So actually, I think Americans have a lot, even if you're not bound by it, you could learn a lot from it, but you need to know it. And I promise you, if I walk out there, most of the people I run across could actually have an intelligent discussion about Otani and 50-50 and how he compares with, Bonds, who was, Barry 40-40, but that was the steroids era, or, his father, Bobby, who almost got 40-40, and we could talk about well, they've changed the rules on stealing bases because you can't throw over first and all the rest. But they have sophisticated understandings of stuff. When it comes to something that doesn't matter at all, like baseball, or, and don't get me started, I haven't even adjusted to the designated hitter, why the National League, went with that, and this starting on second base out in the night. What the heck is this all about? It's nothing sacred, but Americans, you asked me when we started to lose this strong culture of constitutional attention. I think it does begin perhaps with the progressive era, and it carries through. And this younger generation, I paid a lot of money, my wife and I, to send our kids to fancy schools, and they either learn nothing or learn false things. Truthfully, about actually American history. I'm left of center, in case you missed it. I'm Team Harris, okay? But the nation dies if we actually don't have that common cultural core. And I think we did start to, but I promise you, it's so prominent. You see, that's the data all the way through Lincoln. He is picked precisely because he can sing the Founder's Song.
Francis Fukuyama talks about the U.S. as being a vetocracy where there's a lot of places where political progress can be stalled in government. Why is the Constitution and our government set up in such a way that it's more conservative?
I used to think it was too hard to amend. As a young man, I said, it could be so much better. Now I'm an old guy, I say, yeah, it could be a lot worse, and get off my lawn. I'm a Californian. California Constitution is very easy to amend. And we've had a lot of good amendments and a lot of amendments that suck. Okay? And here's the thing. We've had very few bad constitutional amendments at the federal level. That's interesting. What's hard to do maybe should be hard to undo, I begin to think. And I also begin to see that people tend to actually, if you ask them, do you have more respect for the U.S. Constitution or the California Constitution? They'll say the U.S. Constitution. Well, that's interesting, at least. The Constitution has gotten better and better and better in general. Yeah, Prohibition wasn't so good, and we got rid of it, but almost all the other amendments genuinely made amends, adding a Bill of Rights, ending slavery, civil rights, political rights for blacks and women, getting rid of poll tax disfranchisement. The case law have not gotten better or better. The presidents have not gotten better or better. State constitutions have not gotten better or better. So one argument for the thing is we don't want to make it easy to abandon religious liberty. People died for this, religious liberty and equality, and read Michael on that, you know. And so it was hard to get in there, but once it's in there, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, racial equality, sex equality, religious equality, it's not ridiculous to say if it was hard to put in, it should be hard to take out.
I've always found it a lot more difficult to figure out what Washington thinks is essential for the Constitution than, say, Madison or Hamilton, who spent a lot more time writing about it, talking about it, advocating for it in conventions for ratification. But I've always found that there are a lot of little hints that Washington trends a lot closer to consolidation than they end up with. There's not really time for everything, but there's this letter from Knox that presents a really far more national government than they end up with. The most offensive thing is, I think, a standing army for the purpose of coercing the states. And Washington reacts to that pretty positively. He says, like, this would be good. I'm just worried people wouldn't like it because it may tend to annihilate the importance of the state governments. And I wonder, we don't get that, and why shouldn't we think of Washington more like the other major players who win on some issues, lose on some issues, have a lot to do with it getting through?
Wow, you know a ton, and I'm so glad to see someone your age who knows stuff about that. I promise you, you'll find a lot in that book, all about that, a lot. And here's the thing. Washington and everyone else, Washington only cares about two things, and he gets the two things that he wants: strong central government and a strong presidency. He doesn't care about that many other things. Madison wants a proportionate Senate. He doesn't get that. He wants a council of revision. He doesn't get that. He wants six other things that congressional negative. He doesn't get that. But Washington understands. They all understand that the thing is going to have to be ratified by the people. And so actually hovering over the entire Philadelphia Convention from day one is the anticipated response of the electorate. They are thinking, all the other narratives about the Constitution begin in May. Mine doesn't. My narratives begin on September 17th, when the thing goes public. Because throughout the Philadelphia Convention, they are anticipating the day in which they have to release the plan, and the plan's going to actually have to get the votes. And working backwards from that, they actually, yes, sometimes they propose things that are, to them, not what they would do if they could impose something on America, but they can't because they're small d Democrats, they're small r Republicans, and the system is so much more stable because these brilliant guys behind a meeting behind closed doors are thinking about America out there. That's actually an amazing strength of the system, that the smart guys in the room are anticipating how America will react.
Hey, thank you for the great talk.
Is that Michael?
Yes.
Okay. This gentleman here, I was wandering around totally lost, and he saw me, and he gave me directions, and thank you, pal. I knew I was back in California because people are friendly again.
Okay, fair. So the talk was really great, although I wanted to understand a little more about what you mean by being both a liberal and an originalist. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how your theory applies to few cases.
Yes.
If you look at some recent ones like Loper Bright or SFFA versus Harvard, how does your theory of liberal originalism...
Great. I may take some other ones because a couple of those are, especially Loper Bright, pretty in the weeds. But let me take two or three. But let me just take a step back. I just told you who I think the greatest originalist of all time is. And it's not Antonin Scalia, who didn't know anything about history. He didn't. And it's not my teacher, Robert Bork, who actually didn't know so much. It's not even Ed Meese, who was better than these. It's not Clarence Thomas. It's not Sam Alito. It's definitely not Neil Gorsuch, okay? It's not, because these guys don't even read big books about history, much less write them. They don't. I told you who the man is, Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln studies the founding, and he doesn't have a fancy education, but he believes in this thing, and he's a liberal. And I would say in the 20th century, the greatest judge actually of original sensibilities was Hugo Black, the driving force of the Warren Court, who overturns tons of precedents in the name of the Constitution, because it says free speech. And it says the right to vote 5 times. So Martin King is an originalist when he gets up and says 50 years ago, in 1963, he's appealing to Lincoln. He's right in front of the Lincoln Memorial in the March on Washington, who's appealing to the founders when he says 7. Okay, so these guys, and MLK, and he's saying, this is like when Harry met Sally. He says, I'll have what she's having. Okay, it says, actually, in this document, all these things. How about if we do that? Let's do that. And the things that it says are actually pretty liberal, I would say. Equality, robust free expression, right to vote. So let's just take a couple. Constitution is pro-slavery. It is. Fugitive slave clause and other things. But Dred Scott is preposterously pro-slavery. It makes things up in a way pro-slavery direction. And Lincoln says, you just made that up. You say Congress can't prohibit slavery in the territories? Of course they can. They did it from day one. You made that up. And he wins the presidency running against the Roberts Court. I mean, the Taney Court. Okay? And Taney says blacks can't be citizens. What are you talking about? They were citizens from day one. The dissenters make an originalist argument in Dred Scott. And so Lincoln, liberal originalist. Hugo Black, liberal originalist. And if just put SFAA a little bit to one side, just affirmative action, but it says equal. It really does. And Michael has written about this. Michael and I both think Brown is correctly decided on originalist grounds. But the court he said Plessy versus Ferguson. I think it's just really simple that it says equal, segregation isn't equal, that's it. There's some complexities, and he and I differ about slightly how we do the complexities, but that's liberal originalism, taking seriously what the Reconstruction generation really did. Thad Stevens is actually an amazing racial egalitarian. Charles Sumner, now they're on one end of a spectrum, and we'd have to talk about the conservative end as well, and there's some complexities here, but I'll take them any day over the Gilded Age court that gave you Plessy versus Ferguson, which are just a bunch of fat cat judges who have conservative sensibilities and aren't interested in what the Constitution really says. So at least I've given you a little bit of a sense. I think that the driving intellectual force of the Warren Court was Hugo Black, who was actually an originalist. I think Abe Lincoln was a great originalist. I think MLK was a great originalist. And I don't think that conservatives are false. I think it's neither conservative nor liberal across the board. I think Roe was wrongly decided. I'm pro-choice, but I can't get Roe from the Constitution. I don't own a gun, never have. They scare me. But I think you have a right to have a gun in your home for self-protection, more for reasons of the Reconstruction than the founding. So these books will not tell you what I personally think. They're not the words that made me. They're the words that made us, the United States, how we come together. And this is what we have in common. And the Constitution, if read honestly, I think is a pretty impressive document, even judged by the standards of today. That's the thought.
Thank you.
Professor, thank you for your speech. My question is, as an originalist, given the difficulties of in implementing a constitutional amendment today, at what point in the future does the Constitution fail to endure, and under what specific modern circumstances would it fail to endure?
Okay, take another one, or just it fails to endure if it fails to live in the hearts and minds of each generation. We're always one generation away from total failure, so it would die if your generation basically gives up on the project, and it would be especially unfortunate if your generation gave up on the project without even knowing what the project is, because you've inherited this amazing thing, and every previous generation has actually improved. The world is imperfect. It's a fallen world, and yet every generation thus far made it better. Breaking away from England was a good thing because King George III was a jerk. That's actually what this book is all about, but it was pro-slavery for various reasons, and Lincoln's generation made it better, but what about the women and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Alice Paul's generation and made that better? And but we're not being true to our best selves, and MLK's generation made that better. Every generation until yours has actually made improvements, and they've managed to come up with amendments. I mean, they're long periods of drought, 50 years, and then a drenching series of reforms that really made amends. Every generation has done that. I think yours could. We could talk about what those amendments might look like. But if your generation gives up on the project, then of course it won't endure.
Hi. Thank you for your talk. You make a very good argument for originalism, looking at it the way that you do, but I'm also kind of reconciling it with how most people think of originalism, and I'm not really understanding how your argument invalidates a more right conservative view of an originalist reading of the Constitution, because it feels like, to me, I agree with what you're saying, and I agree with looking at that there not only were there just people who owned slaves and people who were anti-citizenship for me, pretty much, but like it's just kind of like, yes, there was, like, yes, Abraham Lincoln was there, but it's kind of idealist to be like, oh, everybody who was working on this project, or this is the true meaning of this project. You know what I mean?
So let me just read to you the first sentence of the 14th Amendment, and there are some reasons why I'm going to do that, but I think originalism well done doesn't stop at the founding. You have to pay attention to the amendments that make amends for what, if you're a Christian, then you can't stop at just reading the Old Testament. You have to read the New Testament as well, and you have to read the Old Testament in light of the New Testament. If you're a proper originalist, we've added to the original story, because the original story failed. We call that the Civil War. Here's the sentence that begins the 14th Amendment, and maybe I'll close on this because my friend Michael is about to give me the hook. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. That sentence says we're all born citizens. We're all born equal citizens. We're all created equal. It's putting into the Constitution a certain Lincolnian understanding of the Declaration of Independence. I think that sentence creates an equality norm. It doesn't say equal in the sentence, but it does say it in a companion document called the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And I think that equality norm applies against federal officialdom as well as state laws. We call that reverse incorporation, but I would deduce it from that sentence. That sentence says, to repeat, we're all born equal citizens. That means we're born equal, and I don't think I'm making it up, black or white. Dred Scott is wrong. He said blacks can't be citizens. I think it means we're born equal, male or female. They could have put the word male there. They did 3 times in another part of the 14th Amendment, but not here, okay? So we're born equal, black or white, male or female, since you're being very personal about, whether someone like you, counted or not. So I think, in fact, we were born equal, whether we're born in wedlock or out of wedlock, whether we're born first in our family or fifth in our family. Alexander Hamilton, you see, was born out of wedlock. The book is dedicated to Lynn Miranda and others. So I think we're born equal whether we're born gay or straight, because if you're with Gaga and if you believe people are born this way, well then, if straights can marry, then gays can marry. Not all originalists think that, but that's not a preposterous way of applying their principle, which is birth equality, which is a radical principle. We're still trying to live up to it. Here's why I'm telling you this today, because I'm grateful that you're allowing me back here, because I was born in the United States. And so I'm a citizen of the United States, because I'm born here. And Donald Trump, I'm born here even though my parents weren't citizens the day I'm born here. But he wants you to forget that because he's not an originalist. I don't want you to forget that. Okay? Kamala Harris, her parents weren't both citizens the day she was born, but she was born here. She's born a citizen, an equal citizen, even though she's born child of non-citizens, at least one parent, and she's born black, and she's born female. And this sentence, it's an amazing sentence when you actually, even if your parents are here illegally, you're born a citizen. That's not the only sentence. I'm picking it because I'm thinking about, especially my parents today, coming back as I am. Tomorrow would be my mom's 92nd birthday. And I'm so grateful to my parents for actually giving birth to me in the United States. Because if they had given birth to me in India, my life prospects would have been very, very different. I have 24 first cousins, many of them, not lucky enough to be born here. They want to come here. The people who were born here don't want to leave. I don't want you. It's so easy to take for granted everything that we have, including some amazing commitments and promises and principles dedicated to the proposition that all, and I think he meant men and women are created equal. Definitely Elizabeth Cady Stanton is going to read it that way. So principled originalists, my friend Michael and I won't always agree. We won't. I think we disagreed on some things even last term. But we're going to, frankly, agree on a lot more than we disagree. I think Roe was correctly decided, even though I'm pro-choice. So it's not going to be everything you always want. It won't. But we'll be playing by ground rules. If you don't like it, you can amend it. And now you will have something deeply in common with your fellow citizens, because you'll all be talking about the same thing, which is the American story, which is an amazing story.
It's painful to put an end. I would have loved to have heard more questions and more answers, but it is time. And so please join me in thanking Professor Amar for such a stimulating talk.